Hi guys, this is Sai Kumar Kurtivada. In this video, we will learn about useReducer hook in React. So we spoke about useState and what is the main difference between these two and how exactly we can use useReducer. I'll talk all about in this video. Before that, you need to understand what exactly useState and how exactly it works. So for that sake, I have created one more video. Please check out that video where you can understand it in an easy fashion. So let me go into the next slide. So here we have React hooks called as useReducer. In this video, I'll target for what is useReducer, why useReducer is for, and what is the difference between useState versus useReducer. So we'll talk all these three topics in this video. Let me go into the one more slide. So here we have to understand three things whenever we are trying to understand about useReducer. One is a reducer function, and second thing is an action, and third thing is what action it is dispatching. So action, dispatching, and a reducer. So actions are something like what action you are doing and how we want to trigger that action. Whenever you are trying to trigger an action, you need a dispatch. So dispatch helps us to trigger an action, and this action will be already defined in your reducer, which will return some set of new state. So what reducer will do is it will take the previous state and then it will return the new state. When it has to return the new state is when a new dispatch happens, it will search for a particular action, and that action will perform some set of operations and it will return the value. So how to use that with an example? Let's go with an example. For example, I want to go with a counter example where you can increment the value. So how we can do that? First thing is, let me use a useReducer hook, and this reducer hook will take one function as a reducer function. So let me create that function. Const reducer function is equal to, I can give an arrow function which will take two things. One is a state and one is an action. So now this is my reducer function. useReducer will take reducer function as a first parameter, and the second parameter is default value. So let me go with the default value of, because we are only going with the counter value. So const, I have something called as counter, and there is something called as dispatch. This counter will hold the current new state, and dispatch helps us to trigger an action. So how to define an action? First, let's complete this reducer function. So now what I'll do is I'll add some switch case where I am treating this action will have a type. So in general, action will have two properties. One is the type of that action and the second is payload. We'll talk about the payload later. So for now, I am talking about action.type. Whenever this action.type matches with any of the case, like for example, let me go with increment case, where you want to increment the value of the state. So what we can do is we can just return the previous state plus 1. So you will get the previous state at 0 for the first time, and when I dispatch an action called as increment, then it will be incremented by 1. And there is another case like decrement, and let me use something called as return state minus 1, and case where I want to go with the default value, and the default value is return state, or let's just return 0. So that is the initial state I am returning, and there should be a default case where it is returning you the current state. So let me return a current state. So that's it. We have three cases and one is default case. So what I want to do is I want to render this counter value, that is the state value, in my UI. So what I'll do is I'll just create a h1 tag with a count value or a counter value where I can show some counter here and save this. Now I'll use some set of div and I'll try to create a button. So button is equal to increment. So I want to create three buttons. Let me copy and paste. So let me show something like decrement, and let me use something called as a reset and save this. Now let me format this. Whenever user clicks on this, I'm using onClick event, and instead of calling the state directly, we will dispatch some action where that dispatch will trigger an action and it will execute some set of code and it will return a new state for us. So how can I dispatch? I can use an arrow function where I can pass a dispatch, and I am expecting my action should have two properties. One is type and a payload. So let me go with the type, and the type should match with our increment case. So let me copy this and put it over here. So now whenever I dispatch this, the current state is 0. So it is increment case. It will go inside this, and the current state is 0 plus 1. So that will return a new state called as 1. So let me save this, and in the same way let me copy this and put it over here and here. So now this is decrement. Let me copy the decrement part and put it over here, and let me copy the default one, copy this and put it over here. Save this and go back. Now let me refresh this and increment the size. Yeah, so let me inspect this. So let me drag this off, go into console, no errors. Now what I want to do is I want to increment. Let me hit increment. So it incremented by 1. It is holding the previous state and it is trying to increment the value, and it is giving a new state for us. In the same way decrement, and in the same way reset. But you may be getting a question, why to do all this? Even we can use by using useState. Yes, you can do by using useState as well. This is a small example which I gave. But in case if you want to do some set of operations which is exceeding more than 2 statements, then you can use useReducer. And also whenever you want to handle a complex logic, it is very hard to handle with the states. So this is a sample example where you can either use useReducer or you can go with a useState. But benefit of useReducer is if you want to increase any different cases. For example, so what I want to do is I want to have something called as decrement by some payload. So how I can extend this? It is very simple. Just you will add a case called as decrement by, and what I'll do is I'll return a state where my state will have a subtraction with my action.payload. So I will be sending a payload in my action, and that will be deducted from my state and it will return. In the same way, let me copy this, let me put this and increment. So let me save this and let me use plus icon. So what I'll do is just I'll copy this button, put it over here. I'll use increment by 5, and what I'll do is I'll just use this increment by, copy and paste here. I'll pass one more parameter called as payload, and the payload value is 5. Let me save this. Now let me use the same thing here and paste this, where I can use decrement by, copy this and put it over here, and I want to decrement by 5. So this is decrement. Save this, go here. Now when I click on increment, it is incrementing by 5. When I click on this increment, it is incrementing 1 by 1, and when I click on increment by 5, it added the previous state with 5. When I click on decrement 5, it decremented current state with 5. So that's how we can increase our logic without touching or without changing more in our component. So here I didn't change more in my component. My component is only doing one thing, that is dispatching a specific action on a particular button or any of the HTML element. That is what it is, creating an event. But overall logic is present in your reducer. So reducer also helps us to create or extend your existing features at any point of time, and it is easy without disturbing your component. You can do all this stuff by just adding some logic into your reducer. So that is also one of the advantage. So what we can do more, for example, here we have only small state and we have extended to a little bit of big state. Even you can do many things like search, or you can use sort, or you can use some set of cases where you can push the elements, update the elements, delete the elements, something like that. So you have complex array, and if you want to update some set of values in that complex array, you can do that. It is very easy whenever you are using this use reducers. But whenever you are handling in a component, you have to create some set of use effects, you have to do lot of logics in your component. Instead, we are performing whole business logic out of our component, and we are getting a new state with the updated values. So that is how you can use useReducer. useReducer is very helpful whenever you have a complex functions or complex logics. So complex logics could be something like you have a form, you want to update that form, then that is a complex logic. So that's how you can use useReducer. Let's learn what is the difference between this useReducer and a state. So let me go into the slide. Here, this is the differences. If you are consider use state, it is used whenever you have a simple and independent state values. But whenever you have a complex state, I said like form with 10 fields or 20 fields, then you can use this complex state with useReducer and you can update easily. And syntax, when you come to syntax, the syntax of use state is very easy and it is very easy to update as well. But compared to that use state, if you are using a useReducer, reducer function you have to define, and you have to define the initial values, and you should know what to dispatch at what time. Everything should be handled properly. That's why useReducer is bit complex. Code organization. when you organize the complex state, use state is not always. When you want to handle the complex states, then always use reducer is required. And as I said, you can extend at any point of time, and use reducers can also be used in other component, whereas use state can't be used in other component. Hence use reducers can also called as centralized state logics. So you can perform some centralized state logics as well. So coming to the learning part, use state is very easy to learn, whereas use reducer you need to understand something like reducers, action, dispatches, all this stuff. So that's why use reducer is bit complex compared to use state. So always try to check what exactly you have to use for your use case or the scenario. So if your scenario is complex, if you want to maintain a centralized state, if you want to use the logic even in the other component, and even if you want to make some functions reusable, then you can use reducer. And if you don't want to do this all, and you have only the small state logics, then you can use state. So that is the main difference between use reducer and use state. So if you really want some other examples on the use reducer, please ping me in the comment section. I'll try to do one more video on the use reducer with complex state. So that's it for this video. Hope you like my explanation. If you like my video, like, share, subscribe to my channel for more updates. Signing off. Thank you.